So today I'll be talking with Eli from Revealed Apologetics. We'll essentially be doing a mock debate on the subject of does the Christian God exist? Obviously, we are both Christians, and I'll give Eli the opportunity to introduce himself here in a second. But for the purposes of this mock debate, I will be taking on the position of someone who is a skeptic, someone who is an atheist, who does not believe in Christianity. The purpose and the goal of this mock debate is ultimately to highlight how presuppositionalists can defend their position in the face of opposition. So with that being said, I want to go ahead and give Eli a chance to introduce himself and tell people where you can find him.
Yeah, so your voice does sound a little laggy, but I did hear you welcome me to introduce myself, so I'm going to do that. My name is Eli Ayala. I am the founder of Revealed Apologetics. I'm a Christian apologist, YouTuber, interviewer, and my day job is I'm a middle school teacher at a Christian private school. I teach 7th grade Bible class and 8th grade logic and debate. And I live here with my 3 kids and my wife in North Carolina, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, so I guess I'll just have you go ahead and kind of start it off by laying out your position as to why you believe the Christian God exists.
Well, I believe the Christian God exists. That question, if you were to ask me, how do I know the Christian God exists? The only way I could answer that is in a way that is consistent with what the Christian faith actually teaches with respect to how we know. And I know that the Christian faith is true because God has revealed himself both in natural and special revelation. The book of Romans teaches us that God's Spirit bears witness to our spirit, that we are his children. And so that's how I know. But I would make the very important distinction between how we know Christianity to be true and how we show Christianity to be true. And so I know Christianity to be true because of the reasons I just provided there. I show Christianity to be true through rational argumentation, which is probably what we're going to be getting into here. So I think that's important to make those two important distinctions. So I believe the Christian worldview is true because God has revealed himself to me, and I try to justify that position through various forms of argumentation and interaction with other perspectives.
Gotcha. So you said that God has revealed himself to you. Can you explain more about how he's revealed himself to you? Because if I'm taking on the position, obviously, as I will throughout this debate, that I'm a skeptic, I'm an atheist, my position is that God hasn't revealed himself to me. So how can I know for certain that God exists if I haven't had this revelation that you claim to have had?
Yeah, what I actually reject that you haven't had this revelation. If the Christian worldview is true, then God has revealed himself to everyone, such that they are without excuse, as Romans chapter 1 teaches. Now, of course, you're not going to accept that position. And so what I'm going to argue is that if you reject the revelation that God has provided, you then, in turn, will lose the foundation for any intelligibility, knowledge. You lose the foundation for science, morality, things like that. Perhaps, if you're interested, we can get into that. But that's my claim. God has revealed himself, and his evidence of his existence is both round about us and within us. And if that is rejected, that actually has some logical ramifications for your worldview. So we're going to have to get into the details of that to kind of flesh that out a bit.
Yeah. So how exactly has he revealed himself to me?
Well, he's revealed himself. The Bible says that the heavens declare the glory of God. And he's revealed himself by writing his law in your heart. So issues of God's law written on your heart, moral inclinations and intuitions, I think this is a reflection of God's revelation to man internally. And I think that there is, interestingly enough, when someone with their mouth rejects the existence of God, they're going to run into conflict with how they actually live their lives. So, for example, and I'm sure within the context of what you do, Hayden, you've seen many unbelievers deny God's existence, yet they'll turn around and affirm things like objective morality, which doesn't work within their non-Christian or atheistic or skeptic worldview. And so right there, I think, is a good example of an inconsistency that with their mouth, they deny the existence of God, but in their heart of hearts, they appeal to things that only make sense if God exists. And I would argue that those are evidences of the knowledge of God that they do have, but as the Bible teaches, they're suppressing in their unrighteousness. So I would evidence the fact that you know God by appealing to things that you make use of, but you can't have unless the Christian God exists. Morality is just one of them. We could appeal to other aspects as well, depending on how much detail you want to get into.
Yeah. So why is the Christian God required for objective morality to exist versus, say, Allah or the Muslim God? And also, why can't I just say that objective morality simply exists? And moreover, how do we know that it's specifically the morality of the Christian God? Why couldn't it just be objective morality simply exists?
Right. So you asked a bunch of different questions. You want to kind of pick one, and then we can take them one by one?
Yeah, I guess let's start with, why does objective morality have to exist, and how do we know that it exists?
Well, my argument isn't simply just that morality proves the Christian God or presupposes the Christian God. I would say something more fundamental than morality is intelligible experience. So to even make sense out of moral intuitions and moral statements, everything that we're going to assert linguistically is going to presuppose categories of logic and uniformity. And so what I would argue is that given the Christian system of thought, logic, universal conceptual laws of thought, and things like uniformity, basically that we could expect the future to behave in similar ways as the past, allowing us to make predictions and to do science and so forth. Those two concepts exist quite comfortably within a Christian understanding of the world, in terms of which things like immaterial entities like conceptual laws and so forth can exist. They don't make sense in an atheistic worldview perspective. So I would argue that things like logic and uniformity, which is presupposed when we speak about morality, makes sense within a Christian worldview, doesn't make sense in a non-Christian worldview. Now, of course, as a skeptic, you're going to disagree with that, but then we're going to have to do some intellectual combat, so to speak, to see which worldviews can actually make sense out of those categories that we both take for granted. So before talking about morality, we have to understand that morality presupposes a whole host of other things that are necessary to our worldviews, and I think those are going to be pertinent to the nature of our discussion, our debate, and our disagreement.
Okay, so it sounds like we're kind of getting into the preconditions of intelligibility. Maybe you would disagree there, but I guess if
Yes, sir.
would you agree that we're kind of at this point getting into preconditions of intelligibility?
Right. So part of the argument of my position is that the Christian worldview provides that which is necessary to make intelligible statements, to make sense out of reality and the nature of reality, knowledge, and so forth. And so to talk about morality, or, for example, to talk about science, we're going to have a fundamental disagreement in those areas because of the undergirding presuppositions that we hold. Now, in this discussion, we can choose to not talk about those presuppositions, and then we're going to just be talking past each other, or we can jump right into the foundations of our worldview perspectives and talk about that which is the very key reason why we disagree and why we will disagree if we just run to those other topics. And so I think what's important in these sorts of discussions, and I think this is one of the reasons, Hayden, a lot of people talk past each other, is that they never get to the fundamental issues. They spend lots of time debating over superficial differences and disagreements. You know, for example, in debates over things of a scientific nature, people will throw evidence at each other, right? My position has more evidence, has more data, more scholarly support, and then the other person's going to turn around and be like, well, wait a minute. Well, my position has evidence in favor of it, and I have this scholar that, supports my view, all the while not recognizing that the reason why scholars disagree is not because one side has more evidence than the other, but there are philosophical underpinnings, presuppositions, if you will, that impact how we interpret the data. The case is, Hayden, is that when we look at things pertaining to science, for example, one side does not have more evidence than the other side. One side does not have more data than the other side. We're looking at the same data. The issue is, what is the nature of our presuppositions that impact how we interpret the data that we come in contact with? I think that's going to be the key issue between us.
Yeah, that makes sense. If I hold to the worldview that there was a big bang, we're descendants of stardust, evolution happened, now we're here, why would that prevent me from then using things like laws of logic or acknowledging those things to be universal?
Yeah, well, you could use them. The question is, are you using them consistently with your broader worldview perspective? Now, unless you don't care about consistency, then yeah, sure. I'm not denying that an atheist can't use logic, right? For example, there are atheists who use logic better than Christians use logic. The issue is not the utilization of logic. The issue is who can account for the existence of logic within the worldview system that we're asserting. And so if you're an atheist, I don't know what position you're hypothetically holding to, but if you are a materialistic naturalist, how do you make sense out of something like abstract, immaterial, conceptual, universal laws of thought? From within a Christian worldview, I have a justification for that. I would then kind of turn the tables and ask on your position. I mean, we could ask about logical argumentation and things like this. We're going to assume and use logic. But how does it even make sense to speak of something like abstract, immaterial, universal conceptual laws from within a worldview that asserts what hypothetically speaking, I don't know the nature of the skepticism you're asserting, but let's assume you're a materialist, a metaphysical naturalist. How do you make sense out of immaterial, conceptual, abstract laws in a world that is purely matter in motion? It seems like there's going to be a conflict there. So I don't want to skirt that foundational issue and then just assume that you have a right to use these categories, but you can't even account for them within your worldview perspective. And that's kind of the angle I'm coming at. I'd be interested in how you would explain that.
Yeah, I'd say there's two ways to go there. Either A, I would take the position that it's just a convention among men. Laws of logic aren't actually universal throughout the world. They're simply conventions that we use as a pragmatic means to solve issues that we find in the world. Or I could take option B, which is saying that they simply just exist, which I would acknowledge isn't intellectually rigorous, and that laws of logic can't, in fact, just simply justify themselves. For example, if you were to say that God simply exists, I, as an atheist, wouldn't accept that. So I wouldn't expect you to accept sort of my justification that they simply exist. So for the purposes of this, I'll take the position that they're simply a convention among men.
Right. So to get to your second part, you said the other route, you could just say they simply exist. Well, by definition, that's arbitrary. So arbitrary is to literally have no reason. They just are. And if that's allowed in philosophical discourse, then of course that undercuts our ability to argue and reason about anything, right? If we're all allowed to be arbitrary, if you're allowed to be arbitrary, then I'm allowed to be arbitrary, then we wouldn't get anywhere. So living out that position consistently would destroy science, it would destroy history, philosophy, and all the other disciplines that we could engage in. So I would say that would be a detriment to your position. I think another detrimental aspect of your position is to assert that the laws of logic are conventional. If they're conventional and they're merely stipulated by human beings, that undercuts what we mentioned before, the issue of the preconditions of intelligibility or the preconditions of knowledge. For example, when we speak of something being the necessary preconditions for something else, okay, we're speaking about what must be the case beforehand. Those are the preconditions. In order for human experience to be intelligible, in order for human experience to be made sense of, okay, if we hold to a position that the laws of logic are convention, then that undercuts the intelligibility of knowledge and human experience, because all I need to do is stipulate different laws of logic that contradict your laws of logic, and you can't say there's anything wrong with that. And so we're going to, lived out consistently, we would just talk past each other because we're using different paradigms of logic at that point. So human convention, I'm just going to contradict everything you're going to say, and you can't really say I'm wrong on your own position. So it seems that your position would be self-refuting.
Okay. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from on the laws of logic. I guess at this point, I do have a question for you, just so that we're kind of on the same page. What do you believe are the preconditions for intelligibility? Sure. I know you've mentioned things like laws of logic. I guess I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what those preconditions are.
Yeah, there are a number of preconditions of intelligibility. So when you're asking what are the preconditions, you're based, just for your audience here, you're asking the question, when I say the preconditions of intelligibility, I'm speaking of what must be the case in order for anything to be intelligible or in order for anything to be meaningful and make sense. Now you're asking me for the specific things. Well, what are they? There are a couple of things. Number one, the universality of the laws of logic. The laws of logic and their universal application, I think, is a necessary precondition for intelligible experience. Deny them, and there are a number of things that you're going to fall into. If you deny the universality of the laws of logic, then you are reduced to pure subjectivism. If you deny the laws of logic, you have to presuppose their truth even to meaningfully deny them, as to make the sentence, I deny the laws of logic, presupposes the laws of logic. So, for example, for your audience, the laws of logic, there are three basic laws of logic. The first law is the law of identity. Something is what it is and is not what it is not. So A is not B, A is not F, or whatever the case. The second law of logic is the law of non-contradiction. A statement cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. And the law of excluded middle is a statement is either true or false. There's no middle option. When you make statements and sentences, your sentences presuppose those categories. So, for example, I kick a ball. That statement presupposes the law of identity. The word kick is different and has a different identity than the word ball. If we don't assume those categories, then I kick a ball is just a meaningful collection of sounds coming out of my mouth. So to deny the laws of logic is to affirm them and is to undercut oneself. It'd be equivalent to saying I don't exist, Well, of course, if that's true, then you have to exist in order to say you don't exist. So the laws of logic are one example of what we call the preconditions of intelligibility. Another one is the uniformity of nature, the idea that there's regularity and predictability in the natural world, right? This is necessary for science, right? If we can't trust that the future will be in some sense similar to the past, all of science and other kinds of meaningful human activity would be impossible. Another one would be the meaningfulness of language. We presuppose that language is a sufficient mechanism to convey truth and to convey ideas. If we don't presuppose that, then we lack the preconditions of intelligibility, right? Personal identity through time. I assume, Hayden, that the person I'm speaking to now is the same person that invited me onto this stream. Without that presupposition, continuity of personal identity, we would not be able to have an intelligible discourse because I'm not debating the same person that invited me to debate. So to deny these categories would deny what we call the necessary preconditions of intelligibility. And then I would add that and then let you follow up. I would also add that in the back of all these, the necessary preconditions for intelligibility would be the Christian God who grounds all of these things. He himself is consistent, and he is metaphysically, with respect to his nature and attributes, he is able to ground all of these categories that we take for granted for meaningful discourse.
Awesome. I appreciate you providing those definitions so we can move forward. So as far as the universality of laws of logic, I'm willing to grant you that my position can't provide the foundation for universals, including universals of laws of logic. So I'll grant you that for the rest of this debate, because I don't see how, given my position, I can support that. Moving on to the uniformity of nature. If I was to make the argument that nature is in fact uniform, or we can expect it to be uniform because it's been that way in the past, what would your response be to that? Why would that be faulty logic or faulty reasoning?
Well, again, this is not something that I would assert. This is something that David Hume, the great Scottish skeptic and an atheist philosopher like Bertrand Russell pointed out, that you cannot have a justification that's non-fallacious and non-circular. When we say that the future will be like the past, okay, you assume uniformity. We ask the question, well, how do you know the future will be like the past? And what is the historical answer? It's always been that way in the past. You see, but that begs the question. It's not even answering the question that I'm asking. How do you know the future will be like the past? The answer to that question is not appealing to regularities of the past, because my question is not about the past, it's about the future, right? So when we assert that the future will be like the past because it's always been that way in the past, that begs the question. That begs that nature is uniform. That's the very thing that's under dispute. This is not some weird thing I'm pointing out as a Christian to try to, quote-unquote, trip up the skeptic. These are points that were made by David Hume, Bertrand Russell, and other philosophers who are in no way friendly towards Christian theism. So this is not a problem for the Christian theist because we have a foundation for uniformity. From within the Christian worldview, we believe that there is a creator God who has created the universe and created it to function the way that it does in an orderly way with predictable patterns that create a foundation for things like science and predictability and so forth. The skeptic doesn't have to accept that, but what I would point out as an apologist trying to interact with someone who holds this position, you don't have to accept that. But what happens when you deny it? When you deny that there is a God who created the order we do see in the world, then you lose a foundation for the order that you will then continue to use when you engage in your scientific experimentation and so forth. And so, yeah, you can use the tools that God has given us and deny the God who's given us those tools. But when you're doing that, you're going to be undercutting your own position, because you, within your skeptical or non-Christian worldview, will not have a rational basis for why you use the very things that you use while denying the God who has provided them. Again, these are not mere assertions on my part. We would have to get into the nitty-gritty as to how you are using the things that only make sense if the God I'm talking about exists, okay? And we're going to get into that discussion of, here's how I justify this within a Christian worldview. How do you justify those things within a non-Christian worldview? Bertrand Russell, David Hume couldn't do it. I would be interested to see someone not of that intellectual caliber try to provide a justification for these things. I don't think it can be done, but I'm open to hearing your side of the argument there. How would you justify it? I've told you how I justified uniformity within my perspective. How would you from within your own perspective?
Yeah, so what I would try to do is I would say that because past futures have had uniformity of nature. We can expect futures to have uniformity of nature, but I recognize that that's fallacious and question begging. However, so while I'll acknowledge that my position can't satisfy uniformity of nature, I do have a question as to how you believe yours can. I understand that given your worldview, God.
Well, before you get to the next question,
Yep.
before you get to the next question, let's take a tally here. So you've admitted that your worldview cannot account for logic, which is a necessary precondition for the meaningfulness of this debate, and you cannot account for uniformity, which is the basis of all scientific endeavor. And so I have provided how the Christian worldview can provide those things, and I have not heard why we shouldn't believe the Christian worldview can provide those things. So in your denial of the inability of your worldview to provide a foundation for these things, you are actually proving my point and helping me kind of provide the argument as to why Christianity is necessary for meaningfulness and science and so forth. So if you disagree with any explanation that I've provided, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts. But if you don't, then we can move on to your next question.
Yeah, so I did have a question still on uniformity of nature. So obviously, given your worldview, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but your worldview would have God as someone who governs the universe, who is in control of it, and thus we can expect to have uniformity of nature. But my question is, does God's governance, in which you say we can expect the uniformity of nature, violate, or when he does miracles, right? When he does miracles that violate the uniformity of nature, because he can do miracles like that, would that then make it so we can't expect nature to actually be uniform? For example, in Genesis 8:22, it says, "As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." But we know that God does miracles. So is God breaking his covenants when he does miracles? Can we expect uniformity of nature given that he can do miracles? I'd just like a little bit more of an explanation on that.
Right. So the idea of the uniformity of nature is not that the future must be like the past, but we can argue that it very probably will be, because it functions in a way that is consistent as God has set it up that way in creation and his providence. So with the reality of miracles, that does not negate our expectation of the future to be like the past. What is my position? My position is that very likely, given the way God has normally governed things, nature and so forth, that the future will be like the past. And notice the very likely allows for the possibility of God to perform miracles. Miracles are not a breaking of the laws of nature. Miracles are just a less regular way of God's sovereign control. And the laws of nature are descriptions of God's more normal way of sovereignly controlling nature. So it doesn't undercut his covenants. We can still expect the future is very probably going to be like the past. We don't do that simply based upon the regularity we've experienced in the past. It's based upon God's promise. What is God's promise? That very generally, these things will work in the way that we expect them to work, because God has governed the world in a particular way. That does not negate the possibility of God, performing miracles and things like this. It would be a problem for my position if the miracles that God performs are random and arbitrary. Yeah, if God just randomly performed a miracle, that would throw off my understanding of the probabilistic expectation that the future will be like the past. But of course, within the Christian worldview, God does not perform miracles arbitrarily. As a matter of fact, in the Gospel of John, miracles are called signs. They're not called miracles. Signs point to something. When God performed miracles, it was always to accomplish a specific purpose. One of the purposes does not include arbitrary performing of miracles, hence making our experience of the laws of nature unpredictable. And I guess we're just living in kind of this haunted universe where I can throw my cup into the air and it'll float up to the sky instead of allowing the laws of gravity to act upon it and make it fall to the ground. So given the nature of miracles, its non-arbitrary nature, I don't think the performing of miracles has a problem at all for my understanding of uniformity from within my worldview.
Okay, I hear your position there. I guess moving on to the third precondition of intelligibility that you mentioned was meaningfulness of language. Would you accept that language is simply a convention among humans, something that's simply used for pragmatic purposes?
Well, I don't think that human beings invented language, if that's what you mean. I mean, according to the biblical story, God created Adam and Eve and began to speak with him, which is interesting. When God created Adam, what was one of the first things that God told Adam, right? Adam said, God says, you could eat from every tree of the garden, right? But not of the tree in the midst of the garden, right? And the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. The quick question that Adam should have asked God is, excuse me, God, what is a tree? You see, God created Adam already with kind of, we can use this language, inbuilt software of understanding communication. Now, human beings might invent the specific sounds that come out of our mouths to refer to specific objects that we want to refer to. But the idea of communication is something that is part of what we call the image of God within us. Notice that this is wrapped up in the personal nature of mankind, which is a reflection of the very nature of God, as God, with respect to his nature, is personal. This is wrapped up in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, right? God is by nature a triunity of persons. And so he is by nature relational, communicative, and hence when he creates man in his image, we are created in a way where we can communicate. So I think that's a natural aspect of what it means to bear the image of God.
Okay. Interesting. I think as far as the preconditions of intelligibility, I think that's probably enough time that I'd want to spend there. I do have, so at this point, I'd say I'm willing to grant you laws of logic. I'm willing to grant you uniformity of nature as things that my position cannot hold. Whether it's unique to the Christian position that can hold it is something I'll definitely be looking to dive into as we go through this compared to other religions and things like that. As far as I know, one thing that you've talked about before is the egocentric predicament. I'd like to know how Christianity solves the egocentric predicament, given that your reading of Scripture is still subject to interpretation. How do you know that your interpretation is accurate? How are you still not stuck in the egocentric predicament in regards to your interpretation of Scripture?
All right. Yeah. So I think you're asking two separate questions. We can talk about the issue of interpretation or the issue of egocentricity.
Okay.
The egocentric predicament is, well, let's define it first. So us being finite individuals, we cannot transcend ourselves to a God's eye perspective, right? Because we're finite, okay? If you hold to a worldview that rejects a God who reveals, then you are stuck in the egocentric predicament because it is impossible for a finite individual to transcend his self to have an objective picture of the world, okay? From within a Christian worldview, though, we don't start with ourselves, right? Part of my worldview is that the knowledge of myself is only meaningful because it's understood with my simultaneous knowledge of God. God has revealed himself, and I am revelation itself. If all of creation reveals God, then that means I'm part of creation, and so I reveal God. The very mental processes that I engage in are a revelation of God. I exist within the context of revelation. So as one who submits to revelation as a believer, my worldview is not, I start with myself and now I need to get outside myself for a God's eye perspective. My worldview is that I have a knowledge of God and I submit to his revelation. God knows all things, he creates all things and defines all things, and so he alone is sufficient to tell me the true nature of the world. And from within the Christian perspective, he's done that, both through the created order and through divine revelation in the scriptures and so forth. And so the unbeliever doesn't have to affirm that, but it makes sense for me to say I have a God's eye perspective on some aspects of reality, because from within my worldview, God has in fact revealed himself. Now, what happens when you reject that revelation? Well, you're stuck with starting with yourself, right? If I say I'm starting with God, and you're saying you start with yourself, you're going to be the one that's in the egocentric predicament, right? Now, when someone says, well, wait a minute, but you have to start with yourself. You can't start with God. Well, no, that's your worldview. Your worldview, which I reject, is telling me where my worldview is allowed to start. Well, from within my worldview, God exists. I have a knowledge of him. My knowledge of God gives meaning and context to the knowledge of myself and everything around me. God is all-knowing. He's all-powerful. He is a sufficient mechanism to reveal the nature of reality and the nature of truth to those that he's revealed it. And so it makes sense for me to say that I am not stuck in the egocentric predicament because God has set things up in such a way that I can have a knowledge of his creation. And so I'm not subject to the egocentric predicament in the same way that philosophies which begin with the finite self with no revelation does. Now, to answer your second question with respect to interpretation, can you repeat that again so that I understand? Make sure I'm answering the right question.
Yeah. So isn't your reading of Scripture still subject to your own interpretation? So couldn't you still be wrong on most, if not all, of your beliefs in Scripture? And if it's true that you couldn't be wrong on all your beliefs of Scripture, I guess I'd just like to know why, given that it's still subject to interpretation.
Yeah, just because something is subject to interpretation, it does not logically follow that we can't have the right interpretation, nor can we have a justification for the interpretation that we provide. So, for example, there are many ways you can interpret 2 + 2. If I were your teacher and I gave the class a test and 2 plus 2, you said 2 plus 2 is 4, another student said 2 plus 2 is 9, and another student said 2 plus 2 is 100, I don't get the test back as a teacher and say, oh, well, I guess there's just different interpretations. I guess we can't know which one's correct, right? The existence of multiple interpretations does not negate that I have a correct interpretation, nor does it negate the fact that I can provide a justification for the interpretation that I provide. I think that language is a sufficient mechanism to convey truth, and so I would appeal to context, linguistics, these sorts of things, hermeneutics, to argue why my interpretation of a particular biblical passage is correct. Now, if the skeptic wants to take a linguistic, agnostic perspective in terms of which we can't understand or interpret things correctly because there's so many different interpretations, then I'm just going to respond. If I can be kind of sarcastic here, I can say, well, thank you for saying that I'm right. Well, I didn't say that you're right. I'm just saying we can't understand. Well, if I can interpret your words in any way that I want, then I choose to interpret your words as saying, Eli, you are the best looking Puerto Rican I've ever come in contact with, right? And of course, I'm joking, but that's silly. Someone who says that all language, because it has interpretation, can't be understood, then that destroys one of the necessary preconditions for intelligibility. You want to throw away the meaningfulness of human language. You're going to shoot yourself in the foot at that point. My position is that, yes, there are things that can be interpreted in multiple ways. There are things that we can argue and dispute over. There are even things that we can't be certain of. But that doesn't necessitate that, therefore, we can't be certain of anything that's open to interpretation. When the Bible teaches that there is one God, I don't think that is difficult to demonstrate, right? That there is one God, there is no other God. God himself says in Isaiah, I don't know of any other God. That's not hard to interpret, even though you have the Mormon come along and say, well, here's what it really means, right? When God says, I don't know of any other God, that doesn't really, you can make counter arguments, but that doesn't mean my interpretation is incorrect, nor does it mean that I haven't provided a good justification for the interpretation that I've provided.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I guess one area that I'd want to push on your position is, why does it have to be the Christian God? Why can't I just make up a God, say that it's 5 in 1, and say that it solves laws of logic, objective morality, uniformity of nature, and knowledge, and write down in a book and call it, scripture, and say that this new God solves all of these problems? Why is Christianity not just, this proposed solution of God of the gaps, that a God that I make up can't, just fill in those gaps as well?
Oh, well, how do you know about this God?
He revealed himself to me and to you.
Where has he revealed himself?
In nature and conscience, and in word,
anywhere
and
else?
in the words that I just wrote down, such that everyone is without excuse.
Words. Can we investigate the word? Can we investigate the words that you claim your deity has provided? Is it publicly? Are we able to examine it publicly and to scrutinize it?
Yeah, let's say that I've just printed 10,000 copies and published it on a website.
Yeah, well, the problem is you haven't published it, and so there's hypothetical. You're putting a hypothetical, but I have nothing to look at, right? Mm-hmm. This is different. With the Word of God has gone out into a much wider audience than your hypothetical. So there's your position still seems to suffer from subjectivity. There is no public access to this hypothetical. I'd have to look into more of the details of your position, and I'd analyze it from there. But let's take your hypothetical. Okay. If you were to say, can you repeat the hypothetical again, just to make sure?
Yeah. Let me actually make it stronger as well. Let's say that someone 5 years ago printed, let's say someone 5 years ago printed 1 million copies of a book in which they claimed that God is 5 in 1, that he's revealed himself to everyone such that they're without excuse, and that in there he put down what he calls verses that describe how the laws of logic simply reflect the thinking of his God, which is 5 in 1. It has a list of commandments from his God that satisfy sort of objective morality, provide a standard for morality. And they say that he says that his God, which is 5 in 1, upholds the universe, was the creator of the universe, and provides it and governs it in a way such that it's uniform. And also that because his God exists, we can have knowledge, since it satisfies the problem of the one and the many, since it's 5 in 1, and it satisfies the preconditions for knowledge, since it provides an outside perspective, thus making it so that we can escape the egocentric predicament. Why would his God be incorrect?
Right. So is this God, this hypothetical God, the necessary precondition for intelligible experience?
Yes. Without this God, you can't make sense of anything or have any knowledge. That's the claim of this God.
Right. So do you hold to this position?
for the purpose of this debate, we'll say, yes, I hold to the position that this person authored 5 years ago, that this new 5-in-1 God is the real God.
Okay, so I asked that question on purpose because if you didn't hold to the position, if someone's like, I was just hypothetical. Well, if you've admitted that the worldview you currently hold to doesn't provide the necessary preconditions, then it doesn't make sense to stand on that insufficient worldview and posit a hypothetical one that you're now admitting is the only necessary precondition for intelligible experience. Now, you're saying for the purpose of this discussion, you hold to that position. So now if you believe that this hypothetical position does in fact provide the necessary preconditions for intelligibility and knowledge and so forth, then what you're also saying implicitly is that the Christian worldview that I've just provided doesn't. Do you mind giving me an example of how the Christian worldview, as I've described it, does not, in fact, provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience?
Well, I would be granting that your position also provides the preconditions for intelligible experience, but so does mine, the one that I just created.
So stop right there.
5-in-1.
So stop right there. Stop right there. Yeah. So you can't. Okay. So stop right there. So you can't grant your position cannot grant me that because I've asked you before. Do you believe that your position provides the necessary preconditions for intelligibility? Now, if we do an analysis on what it means philosophically for something to be necessary, that is that it is exclusive. You cannot have two necessaries. If there is one worldview that provides the necessary preconditions and another worldview that provides the necessary precondition, then neither of those worldviews are necessary because you have another one, you see? So you cannot say your worldview provides the necessary preconditions, but at the same time grant that my worldview does as well. That would be a contradiction.
Why could I not?
So would you like to retract that, or maybe
Well,
expand?
I guess let me ask you a question on that, just so that I better understand. Why can't I say that your worldview satisfies the preconditions of intelligibility with the triune God, and so would my worldview? I understand that they would be in conflict since each one is making an exclusive claim, so they couldn't both be true. But I guess I'm just trying to figure out, why can't someone who, say, 5 years ago comes up with this 5-in-1
They're not
God?
necessary then. Right. So if you're saying a worldview is necessary, but you're granting that there's another worldview that can do what you just claimed your hypothetical worldview is the only worldview that can do, that's a contradiction. A position is either necessary or it's not necessary. You cannot have two necessaries because then by definition they wouldn't be necessary. If something's necessary, this has to be the only view. But then there's this other view that also can provide those preconditions, and that's the only view. You can't have two only views. Does that make sense? So you cannot have two necessary preconditions, especially if you're trying to make a mimicry of my position, which says it is the only view. Does your worldview hypothetically say it's the only worldview?
Yeah, so I want to ask you actually kind of a hypothetical on this to get sort of a better understanding of your position here. So let's say that my claim of this
But
this
can you
God
answer that question first?
Yes. So let's say that my God of 5 years ago claims to be exclusive,
Okay.
right? Yes. Let's say that they claim to be exclusive, right? They reject the Christian God. Let's say that, 2 years ago, right? Someone on the street comes up to you with the book from this God that was created 5 years ago. That's 5-in-1. They say, hey, this God satisfies the preconditions of intelligibility. It's just like the Christian God, but instead of being triune, it's quintune, right? It's 5-in-1. And it's called J. Why would you reject that position as being absurd, or why would you hold to your Christian faith rather than accepting the 5-in-1?
Because the Christian worldview is the only necessary transcendental foundation. I'm not putting that forth as a hypothesis. That is my position. So I would reject a competitor, and then I would examine and critique the competitor, and that's why I'm giving the line of questioning that I'm providing. I'm asking, from within your perspective, does it claim to be the only transcendentally necessary precondition for intelligibility and knowledge? You said yes, but then you also turned around and admitted that the Christian worldview also provides it, which is a contradiction. A worldview cannot be true when it claims to both be the only worldview that provides those preconditions, but then also turns around and asserts that another worldview also provides those preconditions. It is either the case that a worldview can provide it, or it's the only worldview that can provide it, or it is not the case that it's the only worldview that can provide it. Can't be both.
Yeah. So essentially, what I'm kind of trying to figure out
That's
here,
a logical It would be a logical contradiction.
Yes. I understand that they can't both be. Yes, I understand that they can't both be true, right? So what I'm trying to figure out though is why would you?
So
go ahead.
I think there's a lag, so I do apologize. I don't mean to talk over you.
No, you're good. I guess so. The question that I'm trying to ask here, right, is they both can't be true, right? I think we agree on that, right? They're both making an exclusive claim. but why would you choose the triune God, the three in one, over this new 5-in-1 God that was created 5 years ago? Is it simply because one has a longer track record or a longer history of people accepting it?
Well, no. You're asking me, a Christian, why I believe Christian theism as it has been revealed, and I gave you the answer to that. That God has revealed Himself, has bore witness to my spirit that I am His child, that His word is true, and so forth. That is how I know. How I show is going to be through the argumentation and the rational discourse that we're having. And so it's in that process where I'm saying, here's why I would reject your hypothetical. The reason why I believe the position that I do is because of the work of God on my heart and revelation and conviction of the Holy Spirit and so forth. So, you're asking a presuppositionalist why he's a Christian. Why do I affirm the Christian position? I can only answer that question in a way that is consistent with how the Bible asserts why I believe it. The point I'm trying to get at is I don't stop there. I'm not simply saying I believe it because God's revealed it and that's all we can say. I'm trying to show the reasons why your hypothetical doesn't work is that there are logical problems with it. It's a self-contradictory perspective for the reasons that I've just expressed.
Okay, I'm satisfied.
So I don't want people to get confused. I'm not making a bare authority claim. I'm not simply saying Christianity's true because God's revealed it and you know God, but you're just lying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm willing to talk about why I think that, how I justify that claim. The justification is going to come through rational argumentation, which is what we're trying to do here.
Okay, I hear you there. I'm satisfied that I think you've answered sort of that question sufficiently. I do have a question as to why. I understand that you've kind of given me sort of the preconditions for intelligibility. You've kind of explained why you believe that Christianity satisfies them. Why would you reject then religions like Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, which I think as Christians would generally view those as sort of counterfeit religions, ones that have, said that scripture is true, but then added onto them or twisted scripture. Why would you say that someone can't use presuppositionalism to say that Islam and Allah are true? Or could they? And if so, why would they be wrong, sort of in their view that Allah is God?
Now, can you rephrase your question
Yeah,
into
yeah.
one question?
Let me.
It looked like you asked a bunch of different things.
Yeah, I understand. Sorry, I keep doing that. I'll try to do better on that. So, why would you reject? Let's narrow it down to just Islam for this one question. So, why would you reject Islam then? If say a Muslim came to you and said they had a personal revelation that Allah is true and they believe that Islam satisfies all these things, why would you still reject Islam?
Yeah, well, a question like that, I think, issues forth from a misunderstanding of the nature of what I'm arguing for. When I say that the Christian worldview provides the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience and knowledge and science and so forth, that is not simply an authority claim. I'm willing to actually show, given the nature of God's attributes and revelation and so forth, that it actually does in fact provide those preconditions. So yes, a Muslim could argue in a similar way. The question is, can they pay the bills, so to speak, on the claim to being the necessary preconditions for intelligibility and knowledge? And I don't think that Islam is able to do that. There are different ways to demonstrate that. I'm not sure how far you want to get into it, but I'm not making the bare authority claim. So anyone could argue along those lines. By the way, the argument that I'm providing philosophically is known as the transcendental argument. It's an actual argument form. It's not like a weird kind of Christian sort of thing, right? So people can use the argument form. The question is, can they actually defend the argument? If you're interested, I can give you the form of the argument itself to kind of see the line of reasoning I'm using and to show how other positions can try to follow the same line of thinking but fail. Would you like me to do that?
Go for it.
Right. So transcendental arguments take the form, and if you know anything about logic, we kind of substitute statements or premises or propositions with letters. So like X would stand for like a premise or a statement. So X is the necessary condition for Y. Y, therefore X. X, being the Christian worldview, is the necessary precondition for Y. We can say Y is knowledge or intelligibility, right? Y is the case. We do have intelligibility. We do have knowledge. Therefore, X is true. And so anyone could replace X with any worldview they like. You can say Islam is the necessary precondition for knowledge. Knowledge is the case. We do have knowledge. Therefore, Islam is true. But the defense of that needs to be played out. For example, how does the God of Islam provide the necessary preconditions for knowledge? We're going to have to ask some questions to the Muslim, especially given the fact that given Muslim theology, Allah is actually capable of lying. He's able to lie. And so if Allah is able to lie, that throws a monkey wrench into someone's theory of epistemology and knowledge. How do you know you're not being deceived with respect to any fact of human experience that you claim to quote unquote know? So we could examine the worldview theologically and philosophically to show that while it might make the claim that it can provide the necessary preconditions for knowledge and intelligibility and so forth, they can't make good on that claim, whereas Christian theism, I would argue, does. And I'd be open to a line of questioning that would try to expose that it can't, but that's the nature of the claim that I'm making.
Mm-hmm. And so obviously you mentioned that in Islam, Allah can lie, and therefore you don't think that that can satisfy the preconditions for knowledge. What about something like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, which say that, the Bible is true? Obviously, they would kind of have differences with Christians as far as their beliefs specifically about the Bible. But given that, they hold to, and I guess Judaism would fall under this as well, given that they hold to the fact that there is a God, by his nature, he cannot lie, why would those religions be false? Why would you reject them? Would you say that they can satisfy the preconditions of intelligibility? I know that there's kind of two questions there, so let me actually start with just one. Why would Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or people who hold to Judaism, why would their view of religion not satisfy preconditions of intelligibility?
Yeah. Well, there are different ways that you could answer this question, interact with those perspectives. You can do it biblically. So, for example, Mormons hold to the Bible as long as it's translated correctly. So we can use parts of the Bible that they agree with and argue on that basis that there is a conflict there, right? And I think that'd be a very fruitful way to interact with the Mormon, right? Through engaging biblical text and to show that their extra revelation is in conflict with what the Bible clearly teaches. Okay. Now, that might not convince a Mormon, but don't mistake the difference between proving your point biblically and persuading someone. There's a difference between proof and persuasion. I'm sure you understand that distinction, right? You could argue Mormonism theologically and philosophically. For example, when we talk about the necessary preconditions, one of the necessary preconditions for intelligibility are the universal, abstract conceptual laws of logic. I would ask the Mormon, within Mormonism, in terms of which polytheism is true, you have a multiplicity of God. These gods exist within the vacuum of an impersonal environment. There is no all-encompassing, absolute personal God that is the metaphysical foundation of reality on Mormonism. So how does the Mormon God or gods ground universal conceptual laws? How does a finite God ground that which is universal in its application and in its existence, right? So I would think that there's a theological problem upon analyzing the Mormon conception of the multiplicity of gods. There's going to be a problem there. Morality. Whose morality are we to obey? Is it the God of this world? Or maybe there's a God of another world that has a different morality. Which one do we listen to, right? Oh, well, you're obligated to listen to the one in this universe. Why? I'd like to hear the argument for that if there's no absolute, objective, unchanging moral compass. Now, if the Mormon, I'm not sure what they hold with respect to this position, but if they hold to a law, a moral law that transcends the gods, so to speak, I would have to ask as to the nature of this thing. Is this personal? Is it impersonal? If it's impersonal, why ought we obey an impersonal law? All these things are going to come into play, and you can get into some deep theological waters very quickly. So my suggestion for people interacting with Mormons, you could go that route, but I would stick with areas where Mormons agree with Christians, and those would be with respect to various biblical texts and interact with them on that level. But that other option is available if one wants to go that route. With respect to Jehovah's Witnesses as well, I would say they affirm the Bible. Of course, they have an altered translation. Wouldn't be appropriate to call it a translation, but they do have the New World Translation, and there are elements where we can find points of contact with and engage the Jehovah's Witness on the biblical textual level. That is not anti-presuppositional. There is nothing within a presuppositional apologetic methodology that prohibits us from going straight to the texts that Christians and Jehovah's Witness, to some degree, agree on. That's not anti-presuppositional to any, in any way, shape, or form. You can analyze Jehovah's Witness philosophically. That might include asking the Jehovah's Witness about their worldview and trying to show internal conflicts within their worldview, internal conflicts with respect to their conception of God. Their denial of the Trinity, for example, is going to have philosophical implications for what you brought up earlier, the issue of the one and the many. We could talk about that if you'd like. But again, when we're critiquing these perspectives from a more philosophical and theological perspective, it can get very complicated. So it might not be the practical route for the average person to go, but it is there. Depending on who you're talking to, that might be the route one might choose to go in terms of critiquing these perspectives.
Thank you for that answer. I know you mentioned the problem of the one and the many, and that is where I'd like to go next. So I guess, can you just start by stating what you believe the problem of the one and many is?
Yeah. First, I'd like to begin with an apology. I don't know the nature of your audience, so this might be really deep philosophical waters. So can you kind of share with me your audience a little bit? Is this something that's going to be way over their head, or is this something that's in line with the sorts of things that they're interested in or have somewhat of a familiarity with?
Go as deep into it as you can.
Okay. All right. So the problem of the one and the many is a philosophical problem that finds its roots in the history of Western philosophy, especially with respect to the time period of the pre-Socratics. Okay. Pre-Socratics were a bunch of philosophers that were flourishing in the ancient world prior to Socrates, hence the term pre-Socratics. And one of the major issues that they were dealing with philosophically is the metaphysical question of what is the nature, the fundamental nature of reality itself. Is it fundamentally one thing, or is it fundamentally many things? And so these philosophers, these pre-Socratic philosophers, drew different conclusions. On the one hand, you would have one philosopher come to the conclusion that the fundamental nature of reality is that it is an ultimate oneness. Whereas other philosophers, known as atomists, they would say that the fundamental nature of reality is that it is an ultimate manyness, okay? At the most fundamental base, reality is a conglomerate of these individual parts, okay? Now, the problem with this is, philosophically, is how do we bring together what we observe in nature, both plurality and unity? So, for example, I'll give you an example of ducks on a pond. I look at a pond and I observe a multiplicity of ducks. There's duck 1, duck 2, duck 3. How do I bring together the notion of many ducks, this physical notion of these individual ducks on the pond, and this immaterial concept of duckness, what it means to be a duck, okay? So you have unity, duckness, the concept that gives meaning to even speaking of individual ducks, okay? And the many, you have these individual ducks. How do I make sense out of what we call universals, these abstract concepts of the nature of a thing, and the particulars, the individual instantiations of the individual ducks or the individual whatever you're looking at, okay? So you have in philosophy these things called universals and these things called particulars. You and I are particular instances of human beings, but can we meaningfully speak of human beings without the concept of humanity? The concept of humanity is immaterial. The individual humans are material and particular, okay? And so the question is, how do we bring these together? What metaphysical picture can make sense out of particular different things and conceptual universals or unifiers? And so some philosophers says reality is ultimately one, and they ran into problems because if reality is ultimately one, then you have a problem accounting for the distinctions that we see in the world. If everything is an ultimate many at the most fundamental level, everything is an ultimate manyness, then you have no conceptual unifier that brings together in a meaningful relationship these individual things that make up reality. And so skepticism results from asserting that the metaphysical foundation of reality is an ultimate one, and skepticism is going to result when you say the fundamental nature of reality is an ultimate many, because there's no universal conceptual standards to bring these two together. So the question is, how do we make sense out of these things that we know? They are universals, they are particulars. And throughout the history of philosophy, there is no meaningful answer to this. But interestingly enough, along comes Christianity, not even engaging in these sorts of debates, but posits a God who at the most fundamental level is both, in an equally ultimate way, both a unity and a many. And this is wrapped up in the doctrine of the Trinity. God is one being who exists as three persons. The threeness does not derive from the oneness, and the oneness does not derive from the manyness, but both unity and plurality are equally ultimate in the nature of God. And because there's nothing more fundamental than God, everything else that is derived from God, any fact that is derivational in nature, it derives from something more ultimate, in some way, shape, or form, is grounded in that which is metaphysically ultimate, God himself. And so within the doctrine of the Trinity, in the Christian picture of the world, we can bring together unity and manyness because God, in his nature, is both a unity and a many. Now, why is this important to philosophy? Well, when we state things, we make sentences. When we speak of anything, with philosophers, we refer this to predication. When we make predications like the barn is red, I predicate redness of the barn, okay? That presupposes categories of unity and plurality. There are many instances of barns, and I'm predicating an abstraction, redness, to the particular barns in question, okay? Now, what worldview can give meaning to the unifier, redness, and the particularity, barns? Well, you're going to have a metaphysical outlook that can ground both the oneness and the manyness aspects of even the meaningfulness of statements. And so in that sense, and this is kind of a deep philosophy, I hope I'm not losing anyone. This is a very philosophical discussion here. But what we're arguing here from the Christian perspective, if we're going to argue at the deeper philosophical level, is that unless you presuppose the equally ultimate unity and plurality of the triune God, then you lack a foundation for even uttering meaningful statements, which themselves presuppose categories of oneness and manyness. And that is part of, not the entirety, but part of our argument, that unless you presuppose the triune God who's revealed himself in Scripture, you do not have the foundations for intelligible experience, for all intelligible experience presupposes categories of unity and plurality. Now, I apologize. That is a lot. You asked the question. It's part of a broader philosophical discussion there, but that's kind of the route I would take in terms of trying to explain that. So.
Yeah, so I do have some follow-up questions on that, and I appreciate the detailed explanation. I want to be as detailed as I can.
That makes sense, though?
Yes, yeah, it made sense. So I guess a couple questions, particularly on, essentially the question is this, right? Why would Unitarian monotheism not solve it, and why would polytheism not solve it? My assumption is polytheism doesn't solve the problem of the one and the many, because you're still inside the egocentric predicament where if multiple gods exist, then they could be in conflict with each other and you can't actually have knowledge. I guess let's just start with polytheism before we move into Unitarian monotheism. Why would polytheism not solve the problem of the one and the many and lead into not being able to satisfy preconditions of intelligibility?
Well, you still have the question of what grounds unity and plurality. How can unity and plurality be grounded in a finite God? We're talking about the grounding of all of reality itself. The finite God seems to exist within a context of a reality that is apart from itself. It exists within another element of reality that is the more fundamental context in which that individual finite God exists. So by definition, a polytheistic outlook, you're going to have different gods existing in a more fundamental environment, an environment that's necessary for them to even exist. So they're not ultimate. So we're asking, what is can these non-fundamental gods be the fundamental grounding of reality itself? The asking the question is refutes it right there. I mean, you cannot have a non-fundamental being or a contingent being be the ground upon which everything else is contingent upon. It just doesn't make sense. So polytheism wouldn't work for that reason and for, I think, many other reasons as well.
Okay, that makes sense. As far as Unitarian monotheism, is the reason why Unitarian, I guess let me just ask it in the form of a question. Why would Unitarian monotheism not solve the problem of the one and the many?
Well, we still, again, within Unitarianism, you don't have unity and plurality as metaphysical ultimates. And so you're going to have to say that unity somehow, an ultimate unity somehow gives birth to plurality. And that has logical problems as well. And you see, for example, those Eastern conceptions of the world in terms of which pantheism is the case. You know, you have this kind of metaphysical monism in which the ultimate basis of reality is this unity. Well, if ultimate reality is unity, then how do we avoid the problem of manyness being asserted as illusory? A lot of these Eastern religions will say that the manyness is an illusion because the ultimate fundamental nature of reality is this oneness. So when you posit an ultimate oneness, you have difficulty accounting for unity. Unity is just derivational. It's not ultimate in any sense. And so that's why I say that the Christian worldview provides as affirming the Trinity, being fundamental, both unity and plurality do not derive from each other. They are metaphysically ultimate. And it is that metaphysical ultimate of unity and diversity that makes sense out of the unity and diversity that we experience in human experience. And we do not have to assert that unity is illusory and plurality is the real, or that, or vice versa. The unity is real and the plurality is illusory. Okay, Eastern worldviews that do that, when they say, for example, unity is real and plurality is an illusion, then you run into logical issues because the laws of logic presuppose categories of plurality. There's a distinction between the first, the second, the third laws of logic. And so that's why a lot of these Eastern positions will actually posit that the laws of logic are non-binding. They're just, Western categories of thinking. Our worldview is more transcendent and mystical and so forth.
Gotcha. One follow-up question on the Eastern religions before I kind of jump back to the problem of the one and the many. So
Sure.
on the Eastern religions, so I guess from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if they would not satisfy the preconditions of intelligibility, considering they can't satisfy laws of logic, they can't satisfy things like distinctions between multiple things and such like that. Am I correct, or is there other reasons beyond that they wouldn't satisfy the preconditions of intelligibility if they say all is one?
Well, if there are preconditions of intelligibility and the worldview someone posits undercuts those things that are necessary for intelligibility, then yeah, all of those and whatever other thing we might want to add. I mean, say, for example, someone does provide the preconditions of intelligibility, but, they violate one aspect of them. For example, someone says, well, in my worldview, I could account for immaterial objects. But when you flesh out that worldview, it's contradictory in some detrimental way. Well, there's a problem because it does not provide the necessary precondition for one essential aspect of what must be true in order for anything to make sense: logical consistency, right? So I can say my God that I posit can account for morality, but then if the worldview on a whole as a system is contradictory, it doesn't provide a precondition for logic, which is actually essential for making sense out of the rest of the system. So I would say that if it doesn't provide the necessary preconditions of intelligibility, it doesn't matter what else we could add. It doesn't provide the very foundations upon which everything else the worldview posits would have to stand on.
Gotcha. That makes sense. A follow-up to that before I move back to the problem of the one and the many, I want to get this because it's something that you just mentioned. What would you say to someone who then says that the Bible is contradictory and therefore can't be true?
Yeah, well, there are any number of things that you can do. For example, if they posit logic, they must have a justification for logic within their worldview. So I would say, why are contradictions incorrect from within your worldview? Right? So if they can't provide the necessary preconditions of logic or even its universal application, for example, you have people who say that we know things through empirical observation. Well, if that's true, no one has empirically observed that contradictions cannot be true. If you know contradictions can't be true, it's not based on empirical observation. It must be based on some other foundation. Okay, so depending on who's saying it, I would ask them to give an accounting and a justification for the very logic they're using against my position. Now, if they say, well, wait a minute, I'm doing an internal critique on you, Eli, right? Given the truth of your worldview, here are some contradictions. Well, I'd have to see some specific examples because even though there are passages in the Bible that might be difficult, they're not contradictory. It's just not the case. We can do that. Now, you want to be careful in the course of an actual discussion. The Bible is composed of 66 books, 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament. It was written by over 40 different authors, right? All these background information. It's a big book. You can respond to possible or apparent contradictions, but you might be there for a long time, and you might be discouraged the fact that when you answer sufficiently one apparent contradiction, that you'll learn that wasn't what the skeptic's problem was because he just moves on to another one, right? So we know the issue is not simply, the Bible just doesn't make sense, but we can respond to those. First, when someone says something's a contradiction, well, the first thing I like to do, Hayden, is to ask them what a contradiction is. That's so important because a difficulty in Scripture is not equivalent to a contradiction. Or my inability to provide a reconciliation of a passage doesn't equal contradiction either. So defining what a contradiction is first, I think, is very important. And then you can take the apparent contradictory text and engage them in that way. But you want to be very careful avoiding the pitfall of arguing endlessly over a quote-unquote apparently contradictory text. That's why I started with asking the unbeliever to justify the use of logic itself. Because if they can't justify the logic they're using, then from what foundation do they critique your perspective? But I think in good, being someone who's trying to understand their skepticism, you don't want to avoid answering those questions, but you don't want to argue endlessly over those things, because the issue is, I think, far deeper than simply, if you reconcile these two apparent contradictions, then I'll become a Christian. The issue is much deeper than that.
Yeah, one follow-up question on that. That's a little bit not so related to sort of this mock debate, but what would sort of your position be on someone like Cy ten Bruggencate, who says that he doesn't do Bible studies with atheists? I know that's something that he says that is somewhat controversial, I suppose, among presuppositionalists or apologists in general. Do you think that that's a good approach, a bad approach? It sounds like from what you're saying, you'd probably, want to try to answer some of the contradictions people may try to bring up. Just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, Cy is a friend of mine, but I would probably disagree with him here. I understand what he's saying. When we do Bible studies with unbelievers, then they tend to judge the Bible based upon their unbelieving presuppositions, highlighting the fact that the issue is not the Bible contradiction, so to speak, right? They're assuming that they could evaluate the Bible from a neutral and objective perspective and then come and draw good, right conclusions. That's not the case. And so Cy's trying to not cater to that notion of autonomy and allow the unbeliever to inappropriately be the judge over whether God's word is true. I don't believe the unbeliever is judge over God's word, but I don't think that there is anything wrong in principle to show, hey, these are these scriptures here. I would say from within a Christian worldview, here's how I would answer that. Given the truth of Christian theism, given the truth of the consistency of God, here's how I would interact with this, what you call apparent contradiction. And so I would answer their Bible questions from within my worldview. Now, if they're going to critique my answers from their worldview, I'm just going to highlight the fact, well, of course, you're going to disagree with what I'm saying because you're starting with different presuppositions. And that's why at the beginning of this mock debate, I highlighted the importance of understanding our presuppositions, because it is the differing presuppositions, Hayden, that is the key reason why we disagree to begin with. It's not Christians are just blind to the evidence and you're just believing in an old dusty book, right? Even asserting the Bible's an old dusty book that's irrelevant and insufficient to provide a foundation for anything, even that statement itself reflects a worldview that someone's coming from. The problem with a lot of people is, and I wouldn't just say this is unbelievers, I would say even for Christians, a lot of people just aren't aware that the things they say and believe are only meaningful within the worldview in which they assert it. People don't think in worldview categories, and so they just think, well, this is obvious. I mean, the evidence is right in front of your face, or as we often hear, Hayden, the evidence speaks for itself. That's just such a naive way of coming about it. Evidence doesn't speak, right? People do. Science doesn't tell us anything. Scientists do. And scientists have their worldview, they have their bias, they have their assumptions and all these. Even the use of science itself is worldview dependent, right? That's why I say, well, most scientists say this is the case. And then I'll say, well, I know some scientists who disagree with that. And, he's a Christian. Well, he's not a real scientist. Oh, so I see. So that only real scientists are the ones that agree with your position, and if they're Christian, they can't be right because they're religious. You see, that's why if we don't address the presuppositions, then we're going to talk past each other, right? We need to identify the bias that we have and how they impact the way we interact with questions like this. I think that's it's going to be a move in the right direction in terms of which we can communicate better with those with whom we disagree.
Gotcha. I appreciate that explanation. Getting back to sort of the problem of the one and the many. So I do have one more question on that. So why would someone who is a Unitarian monotheist, like a Muslim, for example, why would he still have the problem of the one and the many? I understand that he doesn't have the triune God, so he doesn't have sort of the solving of that problem by the very nature of the God, where in Christianity, God is three in one, co-equal, co-eternal, therefore solving the problem of the one and the many by having sort of this fundamental equality of unity and distinction. So he doesn't have that, but sort of given his premises that there is a God, couldn't sort of the Muslim or someone else who is a Unitarian monotheist, say, who proposes their own God, say, my God is one God and he makes distinctions in the universe by his created order. Why would that be a problem, or would it not be? And would you engage in some sort of other sort of approach and trying to sort of take down that worldview?
Yeah. Well, I don't, I mean, the problem of the one and many, I think, is a central problem, but in terms of day-to-day interaction, it almost never comes up because most people aren't aware of these philosophical categories and things like that. So from a practical standpoint, I don't tend to bring it up. There are other routes that you can take. But for the reasons that I expressed before, though, if you create plurality, then that means plurality is not fundamentally equal. Remember what I said with respect to the Trinity. Both unity and plurality are equally ultimate. One is not derived from the other, and vice versa. When you take the route of the philosophers positing an ultimate unity that creates derived plurality, you run into problems, and then vice versa. So I would kind of use those same kinds of argumentation, but for practical purposes, I probably would stay away from these discussions. Here's something I want to highlight for your listeners. There is a distinction between how we argue for Christian theism on YouTube, okay, and how we argue for Christian theism in face-to-face interactions. I'm sure you are familiar with this, Hayden. I have a friend, Nate Sala, who is the host of the Wise Disciple YouTube channel. Great YouTube channel. I definitely encourage people to check it out. He does what he calls the debate teacher reacts, and he will react to certain debates, but he'll often tell people that it's a problem if what you're learning with respect to apologetics and evangelism, all you're doing is watching debates and then going out there and evangelizing. That's wrong-headed, because a debate is very different than interacting with people on the street like you do, Hayden, right? If you were to talk to people that you talk to like someone is engaging in a formal debate, you wouldn't really get very far. And debaters they tend to be somewhat experts in particular fields and narrow domains, which is not the case when you're talking to someone on the street. You need to be able to speak at a person's level in a way that's understandable. Now, me coming onto this show, I'm not aware of your audience, and so I'm just thinking, okay, you're asking me these questions, so I assume they probably might be familiar, but they might not be. Someone might listen to this and be like, I have no idea what that guy was saying, and that's okay. But we want to learn the context in which we're communicating with people and be able to speak to the person. I work with teenagers, and so I don't talk about these things in the same way that I've been talking about them with you. And I talk about them, but it needs to be contextualized, right? So I think that's very important. I don't remember your initial question there, but those are those are my thoughts there. I forgot what you asked, so I do apologize.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good. Sounds good. So I do have a question. So one of the things that I would, I guess, let me return back to the mock debate thing where I'm taking the position of an atheist. Why is it necessary to satisfy the preconditions of intelligibility if I can live just as good of a life without believing in the Christian God that you say satisfies these things?
Can you repeat that again slowly?
Yeah. Why is it necessary to satisfy the preconditions of intelligibility if I can live just as good of a life without believing in the Christian God that you say satisfies these preconditions?
What do you mean by good?
Let's say by good, I would mean that it increases my overall happiness.
Right. So I asked that question on purpose because one of the necessary preconditions is a meaningfulness behind the words that we use, right? If you don't have a standard of good, what is the good life? Then how can you say I can live a good life just fine without your God, but you can't even define what goodness is? Now, if you define goodness in the subjective way that you just did, there are other questions that I could ask. There are any number of directions we can go in terms of discussion. But you are reducing everything to kind of pragmatic usefulness. Why do I need to satisfy the preconditions for intelligible experience? Well, why do we have to have reasons for? Do you believe, Hayden, that we should have good reasons for the things that we believe? Is that your position, that we don't need? Why do we need a justification for the things? Are you promoting arbitrariness or just asserting our beliefs and really not worrying about why they're true and so forth?
Yeah, so I'm asserting pragmatism. Why is it necessary that we solve all of these philosophical problems if we can increase the overall happiness for as many people as we can without actually solving these preconditions of intelligibility or moral absolutes and things like that?
How do you know what increases human happiness?
Well, so I'll acknowledge that I can't hold...
What increases human happiness?
Yeah, so I'll acknowledge, for example, I can't hold a unit of happiness, right? That's not something that I can necessarily measure. It's something that's immaterial and I'll acknowledge is hard to measure. But I think as a society, we can kind of look at the world and say that certain actions will increase happiness and decrease pain, and that those then are good actions to take. And it's not necessary to satisfy all of the preconditions of intelligibility or these philosophical questions. We can live just as good of a life without actually satisfying those things.
Well, you first haven't defined in any objective sense what good is, but when you say we look at society, what parts of society? There are people who are not pragmatists and disagree with everything you're saying. Seems like you're just picking apart a segment of society that seems to see things the way you do and then draw conclusions from that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to abandon sort of that line of questioning at this point, because I think I can see where that's going. I think that's going to add probably an hour onto this conversation. I don't want to keep you too long. So I'm going to table that line of questioning for now. Okay. I do want to talk a bit about the problem of abstracts. I think we've kind of covered the problem of abstracts, I think sort of a little bit, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, because that's something that I know I personally need to learn more about. And I think my audience would like to learn more about as well. So I guess what is the problem of abstracts, just to start?
What do you mean? What is the problem of abstracts? Are you talking about the existence of abstract objects?
Yeah. So things that
like
are
love
immaterial,
and justice and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I guess as we kind of covered it a bit with the problem of the one and the many.
I don't think there is a problem.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, it is related, Hayden. I don't think there is a problem. I think, for example, you said, how do we know morality is it just exists? Okay, so what is the nature of that existence? Are you putting forth what might be called Platonic moral realism, that there are these Platonic ideals out there, goodness, justice, they just exist out there, independent of minds, they're just there in this immaterial abstract realm? If that's the case, what obligates us to live in accordance with these impersonal abstractions floating out in the ether, right? There's no obligation that brings that bridges those moral realities to like how we live our lives, right? I don't think there is a problem with abstractions. I think abstractions are demonstrably true. For example, I make the distinction between the thoughts in my mind and the activity in my brain. Some people will equate the activity of the brain and the thoughts in our mind as the same thing. My mind is reduced to physical activity in the brain. I just think that's demonstrably false, and I think that there's good reason to think that there is abstract, immaterial realities to the human person. For example, if my thoughts are equivalent to my brain, my mind is equivalent to my brain, then there should be a one-to-one correspondence between my thoughts and my brain. But that's demonstrably false. My brain weighs a certain amount of pounds, but my thought of a sunset doesn't. And so you have a quality of my thought that's different than qualities of my physical brain, hence demonstrating that they're not equal. So I don't think there's a problem of abstractions. I think they're demonstrably proven. And remove abstractions, then you actually undermine the preconditions of intelligibility. Because what does it mean to talk meaningfully about particular things without reference to abstractions? Someone says, "Hey man, look at those. Look at those two cows over there." Two? What's two? Are the animals equivalent to two, or is there a abstract concept of two-ness that allows us to speak meaningfully of the cows that we're observing? Remove two, and you can't even speak of cows. You see? So I don't think that it's a problem. I think that the abstract concepts provide the preconditions for the meaningfulness of talking about any individual thing. Even the use of the word individual, or even the idea of, comparing things. Comparison is an abstraction. The ball is underneath the table. Underneath is a relation. A relation is an abstraction. You couldn't even make meaningful sentences if you denied abstraction. So I would say that I don't see a problem with it. I think that they are necessary for meaningful discourse.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so one of the areas that sort of throughout this conversation I had noted as something I wanted to come back to, because I think it's probably the spot where, sure. And I don't mean this offensively, but the spot where I think probably the weakest answer was provided. I don't mean that offensively. It's a question that I don't think many people have really thought too much about. But so I wanted to.
Hey man, I'm not perfect. I'm sure I've said a bunch of things that are weak. No worries.
No, you've done good. But I did want to circle back to this, right? So let's say that let's say I'm the person who wrote that book 5 years ago that I mentioned earlier in sort of that hypothetical, right? Where I printed 1 million copies of it. I say that God is 5 in 1, that he has pretty much most of the same traits as the Christian God. Let's say, I skew the morality a little bit to be a little bit more appealing to the modern culture or whatever. But let's then say that you as a Christian apologist, let's say on the street, and I as the apologist for this new 5 in 1 God, both approach a stranger and we both give our pitch. Why should someone choose Christianity over my pitch, given that our pitches are pretty much are going to be very close to the same as far as metaphysically what the nature of our God is, what his characteristics and attributes are? Why should someone choose sort of the Christian God over like the 5 in 1 God that I would be proposing to them there? And I know it's a little bit tough to answer because obviously you don't have like, the written text of the 5 in 1 God or whatever, but
Yes, that I think that posits a problem for the hypotheticals. We need more information. But you're asking me, why should someone pick? Why does anyone pick from within the Christian worldview, from the position that I'm coming from? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, technically we don't pick. It's only by the grace of God.
Why does anyone pick Christianity?
Yeah, it's only by the grace of God that he replaces our heart of stone and gives us a heart of flesh.
That's right. So that's the only way the person's going to see the truth of what I'm saying, right? My argumentation is part of how I present it. So I would say, why should one pick one over the other? Well, he's not going to pick one over the Christian worldview unless the grace of God is acting upon him. Now, why should he listen to my argumentation? Well, my argumentation still stands. While I agree with you, Hayden, that I probably gave some weak answers somewhere, I don't think that this was one of the areas, in my opinion, because I still think that the idea of there being two, because you did admit that the Christian worldview is a worldview that provides the necessary preconditions, that undercuts the claim that you're trying to make in the hypothetical that it's the necessary precondition. So unless you can show me how you could have two necessary preconditions, but they're different worldviews, how can you have two necessary preconditions of intelligibility? Can you help me make sense out of that?
Yeah. So I guess, sorry, could you repeat the question? I want to make sure I answer it before I bring up my point here.
Right. So you were positing this hypothetical worldview, and I said, is this worldview the necessary precondition for intelligibility? And you said, yes. And then I said, so that assumes that my worldview isn't a necessary precondition. And you were like, oh no, it is a necessary precondition as well. And I said, well, wait a minute. That's a contradiction because you cannot have two necessary preconditions because by definition, necessary makes it exclusive. So you're saying my hypothetical worldview allows for the existence of two necessary preconditions, which is a contradiction. So unless you could explain to me how that's not a contradiction, I'm going to repeat my answer because I still think it's relevant.
Yeah. Thank you for repeating that. So what I would say is, let's say that in this example of like the religion invented 5 years ago or whatever, let's say that it says that, Christianity is false. It's the only God, goes by a different name. Because to me, I think to atheists who would be watching this, they would be looking at sort of what you're saying and saying, well, you're only saying that the person should choose Christianity and setting aside, the Calvinism view that they're not actually choosing, which I agree with. I'm a Calvinist. They would be saying it seems arbitrary that you'd be saying the Christian worldview is stronger than the one that say is invented like 5 years ago. Like it seems like it's only being based on sort of, faith, I guess would be how they would put it, or based on sort of historical significance.
Right. Yeah, well, that's not what I'm saying. So when we say it seems arbitrary means to not have a reason. It just is, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying part of my argument is that the Christian worldview does provide the necessary preconditions. Now, if someone disagrees that it does, then I'd like to hear the response, which you in the hypothetical scenario haven't provided, and any atheist is welcome to internally critique the Christian worldview. But I'm arguing that if it does provide those preconditions, as I tried to explain, then it logically follows that it is the only position that can do that because you could only have one necessary precondition. If the necessary precondition for intelligibility is shown to provide those preconditions, then by definition of being necessary, it must be the only one, since by logical necessity, you cannot have two necessary preconditions for the reasons I was just expressing before. So it's not arbitrary. They might disagree. Maybe they'll say, hey, but I don't think Christianity provides those preconditions. Okay, that's where we need to talk. So what is it about the Christian worldview that you think does not provide the preconditions of intelligibility and knowledge and so forth? And I'd be willing to entertain those. It's just that we can't get past, and I don't mean you and I We can't get past many atheists just thinking I'm making the assertion. I'm not. I'm inviting you to say, hey, look, the Christian worldview provides those preconditions. Here are these preconditions. Here's how the Christian worldview provides it. If it provides it, by necessity, if it's a necessary precondition, it must be true. Along comes the atheist and the skeptic. This is what I'm helping you out, skeptics. Here's what you need to say now, right? If you disagree. Mr. Christian, I don't agree that what you've provided as for the Christian worldview actually provides the preconditions for intelligibility because fill in the blank. Now, if they don't offer the fill in the blank, you can't turn around and say I'm arbitrary because I've given you reasons why I think the Christian worldview does in fact provide those preconditions. So we need to do a little bit more of the heavy lifting on the atheistic side or the skeptic side to actually interact with the Christian worldview's claim, an argument that's just been provided. It's not just a claim, it's an actual argument. The transcendental argument I just expressed has an actual logical form. X is the necessary condition for Y. Y, therefore X. That's not fallaciously circular. That's a logically valid form of argumentation. What comes next is an actual interaction with what I'm actually arguing, not simply asserting that I'm making arbitrary claims.
Okay, I'm going to re-ask the question probably just slightly differently to try to sort of narrow in on kind of what I'm trying to get at. So, like, you know, me representing the 5-year-old made up religion and you the Christian, we both approach the atheist. Let's say the atheist says to you, he says, yes, you, Eli, your Christian religion does in fact satisfy the preconditions of intelligibility. It makes sense of the world. And if it is true, it's exclusive and other religions can't be true. And then he says, but all the same is true of the religion that Hayden's presenting that you made up 5 years ago. Obviously, they can't both be true. So I'm going to have to pick one or the other because they're both making exclusive claims, but they both are satisfying all the same things and they're eerily similar. Let's say that the only difference is, let's say in the made up religion from 5 years ago.
You skipped the part though. You slipped up. You slipped up though, because we're not making the same claim. My worldview is that not only is it the necessary precondition, but it is the only necessary precondition. You're not asserting that. Your worldview is saying your worldview is the necessary and my worldview also provides those. That's a conflict in your worldview, not in mine. You're contradicting yourself while asserting the truth or you're asserting within your perspective that there are two worldviews that are different from each other, but both sufficiently provide the necessary preconditions of intelligibility. That's a contradiction on your view. If your view is contradictory, then by definition, it doesn't provide the preconditions for intelligibility. My position is consistent. It says it's the only one, and it is one, and you, as the opponent, is even admitting that it's one, which seems to prove my point. So I don't think it's the same. I think your position is actually logically contradictory.
Okay, let me ask it one more time. I'll try to clarify a little bit more. Because I do hear what you're saying. I do hear the critique.
But do you see where I'm?
Yeah, I see where you're poking, but I think you might just be slightly misunderstanding sort of the question, which is probably my fault because I didn't have this written down, so I probably not stating it quite as clear as I could. Right. So let's say that once again, me and you walk up to like the atheist. The atheist says to you, your religion makes sense. It's making an exclusive claim. It satisfies all these things. And then he turns to me, right? And let's say let's say I was a true believer, right? Let's say I'm the one who made up the religion. I'm a true believer. I don't believe Christianity is true because I believe that this made up religion is true, which let's call the religion just J as just a random letter. So I believe that J is true with 100%, confidence. I'm pitching it to the atheist. The atheist says to me then, yes, J also satisfies all these things. And J is making an exclusive religion claim saying that Christianity can't be true because J is true. At this point, the atheist says the big differences that I see between Christianity and J is that Christianity has much more of a historical prominence and has, say, like slightly different morality than what is proposed in J. And J is new, created like 5 years ago, doesn't have historical prominence. Let's say it doesn't have a big following, but has morals that are more in line with modern culture. Those are the big differences that they see. Why do you, because what the atheist is going to say is they're going to say this person who invented the religion J, if you as the Christian are rejecting that, then why wouldn't we also reject Christianity? Since at some point in time, they'll say that someone had to invent Christianity is what the atheist would say. So I'm just curious how you would respond to that.
Well, there are a number of things that you said. So I have to pick something that specifically. So let me see. So is it still your position from this hypothetical that the Christian worldview is a worldview that provides the necessary preconditions? Is that still your position?
That would be the position
So you're
of,
saying both worldviews equally provide the necessary precondition?
well, so what I'm saying is that like the Christian apologist believes that his worldview is the only one that satisfies the preconditions. And then the person representing the religion of J is saying that J is the only one that provides the preconditions. Now, since J is essentially a duplicate of Christianity.
So now you're changing it.
Sorry, go ahead. What
Right.
am I changing?
So now you're changing it. So now you're saying J is not saying that my worldview provides it. So you changed it? Because before you were saying J provides it and Christianity provides it. How does he choose between? Now you're saying only J provides it. Did you change it, or was that a
No,
slip-up?
this is where I think you're getting a little confused on what I'm saying. So like the person who is, let's say you in the scenario, right? They're saying it's exclusively Christianity. The person who's the proponent, the creator of the J religion, is saying it's only J. The atheist is saying, I'm looking at both of these and they can't both be true, but I see that either one could satisfy sort of these preconditions. Now, granted, I understand that from the Christian's view and the point of view of the person who's advocating for the religion J, neither of them believe what the atheist is saying, that they both can satisfy these things. But to the atheist, they think they can. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, but then he'd be incorrect then. If the atheist is going to say, well, it seems like both of them can account for them, I'm gonna point out nicely to the atheist, actually that's a logical impossibility because of the very thing I was mentioning to you before, that you can only have one necessary. So either one of us is right or both of us are wrong. You cannot assert that both of them equally provide those preconditions. That would be a logical incompatibility. If they think, well, it seems to me they do, well, seeming doesn't mean that it's actually the case, and I would actually encourage the other person, the proponent of J, to unpack their worldview more, because I don't think they're as similar as you say in the hypothetical. The thing is, not only is Christianity older, that's not my argument, because it's older, it's more trustworthy,
Yes,
but
I understand.
we have public examination. We just can't do that in your hypothetical. So, I mean, we can't really move anywhere in the hypothetical because there's no one-to-one correspondence as to the nature of the public examination of Christianity versus the public examination, or the lack thereof, of your hypothetical religion J. So I would say that the atheist says, oh, it seems to me, like I would just point out, just because it seems to you doesn't mean it's actually the case. Here's why it can't be the case that we're both equally providing these necessary preconditions.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess one thing that you had mentioned to me before that I think I'd be curious to get your thoughts on in this situation is you said something along the lines of a rose by any other name smells just as sweet, and that, you know, someone who makes up sort of this duplicate religion is essentially giving evidence that they in fact in their heart of hearts do know that the Christian God is true, because they recognize that in order to even have a religion that can satisfy these preconditions, it essentially has to be a clone of Christianity, just called by a different name. I guess I'm just wondering if you could elaborate more on that for me and my audience.
Yeah, sure. Just as a heads up, I have an entire video on my channel, Revealed Apologetics. Literally, the entire episode is based on this very question. The objection that you're bringing up with this hypothetical religion that looks like Christianity is actually an old objection called the Christianity objection. So you called the religion J. In the literature, it's actually called Christianity, which is a religion similar to Christianity, but not quite. So this is an old objection. So for example, it's kind of akin to when someone, and I used this example before with the Kalam cosmological argument. Okay, maybe your audience is familiar with this argument. It's a very popular argument in apologetics. The argument goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Okay? Usually people will highlight the fact that this is a logically valid argument. Okay? It is valid. The conclusion does follow from the premises if the premises are true. And of course the debate is, are the premises true? If they're true, the conclusion follows. And then we ask the question, well, what does it mean for something to be the cause of the universe? Okay? If the universe is all space, time, matter, and energy, whatever the cause of the universe must be, must transcend those categories. So if it brings all material things into existence, the cause of the universe cannot itself be material, okay? Because materiality would exist before materiality. You see what I'm saying? So there's a problem there. So if someone says, well, wait a minute. Why does it have to be your God as the cause of the universe? What if it's a magical pink unicorn that brought the universe into existence? Now, the problem with this is that unicorns are finite. They take up space, right? If they take up space and they don't bring space into existence, they have already existed within space because they're physical objects. Oh no, Eli. This unicorn is an immaterial, universal unicorn. Okay? And then hopefully you get where I'm getting. When they start ad hocly qualifying the unicorn, what you find is that the unicorn will have all the attributes that we are asserting God has, right? Immaterial, extremely powerful, right? You may even make an argument that it must be personal because you have a state of timelessness, choosing to enter into some kind of relation to time as he creates time, space, matter, and energy. So this is what you call ad hoc, right? Someone is adding qualifications to, quote unquote, make it fit. Okay. And it's the same thing with the argument that I've been given. Someone's like, well, there's a religion just like Christianity. I'm like, oh, okay, well, how does he account for morality? Oh, he accounts for morality this way. Yeah, but that doesn't work because of this. No. It's because he's the standard of morality. You start qualifying the hypothetical until it looks like the God that I'm talking about, which case is the context for why I quoted Shakespeare there. A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. You're just positing God and calling it something else, and then acting as though that's an argument against the position that I'm putting forth. And that is a quintessential example of the biblical notion of suppressing the truth. That's the length that they have to go to deny the God that I'm talking about, that the scriptures are talking about. And so that kind of just undergirds my point as opposed to vitiate against it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks a ton for hopping on the call and doing the mock debate. I'm sure my audience will gain a ton from it. If you want to just to close it out, mention anything else or tell people where to find your stuff.
Sure. Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for reaching out for me. I've never done a mock debate before, and this was a lot of fun, and I think hopefully it'll be informative to your listeners. But once again, my name is Eli Ayala. I am the founder of Revealed Apologetics. I have a YouTube channel called Revealed Apologetics where I unpack the methodology that I've been discussing. I also interview very well-known theologians and apologists, so if folks are interested in those sorts of things. And I also teach apologetics. I have a course where folks can sign up on my website, revealedapologetics.com. It's called Presuppositional Apologetics, Precept University. You can click down that window and sign up, and I go through a whole 5-series lectures along with notes and PowerPoints to help people kind of follow the line of argumentation that I like to use. But if anyone wants to reach me or they want to interact with me, ask me a question, or have me speak at an event or whatever, they can contact me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you, Hayden, and I was checking out your YouTube channel shortly after you reached out to me, and I really love what you're doing. Keep it up.
Thank you. I appreciate it.